And to take us into that moral crusade, the Reverend Dr. Katharine Henderson, the president of Auburn Theological Seminary, is going to come up here in a few minutes, and she's going to share her perspective and her remarks, and then welcome to the stage Rabbi Jonah Pesner from the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism, which is known as the RAC, I believe, and has been a long-standing action center for faith and democracy. She'll also be joined by Keesha Gaskins of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and then a program director, very interested in these questions, very much a leader in these questions and this work for our democracy. And she'll be joined also, gotta make sure, she'll be joined by me, I just learned. so that kind of threw me. It's not in my notes. I'm not on this panel, but Katharine has said, yes, you are. And so, especially on Sunday, I follow the Reverend and go to my chair when I'm told to. So I will be on this panel. But also on this panel is our friend Carolan, who's been with us these last 2 days. And he is with the Franciscan Action Network. And they do wonderful, exciting work as well. So I'm really excited about the panel discussion. And I'm really excited in just a minute to welcome Reverend Katharine Henderson to the stage.
I'll be sharing this with Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who is celebrating the New Year, and we'll be celebrating together. And so, a sweet and happy New Year, and we'll share this, honey, with you.
Thank you.
So, Pope Francis, and I'm not going to introduce you again. You've been introduced. Consider yourselves welcome, because we've got to move quickly here. There's a lot to say. Pope Francis, also a prophet, has said we've created new idols. The worship of the golden calf of old has found a new and heartless image in the cult of money and the dictatorship of our economy that is faceless and lacking any human goal. So this is not a political issue only, and we're up here because we're the panel on morality and faith. So let's start with you, Jonah, since you're right here, and let's talk about how this is a moral issue, not just a political one. From your perspective.
Sure. And Shana Tova to any of the Jews who are in the room, like me, trying to figure out how we're going to get to our festival celebrations tonight. And I'm grateful that there is honey in the mix. I don't know, Jeff, if you realize the connection, but it is, of course, traditional to eat apples and honey on Rosh Hashanah. So, first of all, I just want to echo the words of praise you all gave to the great Katharine Henderson, who is a true hero in the faith-based movement for social justice in America, who has brought together people of all faiths to be the engine of social change. And Katharine, we're most grateful to you for the leadership that you provide.
I did not pay him or influence him to say that.
It was truly heartfelt.
Thank you, Katharine.
And I urge people to read the report. It's really startling, inspiring, and agitational all at the same time. So a word of context about why I'm on the particular panel as a way in to answer the question. My office is in a historic building just a mile or so down Massachusetts Avenue from here. The Religious Action Center in DuPont Circle is actually the site of the drafting of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It turns out that it was a Reformed Jewish institution that housed the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. When Dr. King would come to Washington lacking any offices, he would sit in our conference room. I tell that story not only to celebrate, as we have this incredible, important conversation about democracy in America, celebrate the role of the Jewish community in that, but more broadly, the faith community. The civil rights movement was, of course, a faith-based movement. Dr. King was first and foremost a prophet, a reverend, member of clergy, and as Reverend Barber and I often speak together on panels about the current civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter. And I always credential myself by telling the story of the drafting of the Voting Rights Act in our conference room, which is, of course, under assault as part of the whole assault on democracy, like money in politics, but also voter suppression laws. And Reverend Barber likes to follow when I speak, and you always speak before Reverend Barber. You never speak after Reverend Barber. Reverend Barber is a fellow at Auburn, by the way. He likes to say, Rabbi Pesner, I would amend your story to remind people that the Voting Rights Act was written in the blood of Selma and in churches across the United States. And of course, that is correct, that the civil rights movement was a church-based movement or a congregation-based movement. So this, to me, is not just about the moral imperative. It is, and we'll lift up our different religious texts in a moment. It's what Katharine said earlier, is the power of the numbers. It's the power of the numbers. Don't leave us, people of faith, out. Rather, keep us at the center of this movement. Every church, mosque, synagogue, temple, shrine in our country ought to be having a conversation this Sunday, this Friday, this Saturday about the way in which democracy has been hijacked and the way in which democracy is a faith issue. Because that's what will create an engine and change of America. And it's the evangelicals and the Catholics and the Muslims, the AMEs, the African Americans, the Baptists, and the Jews all have to have that conversation. And too often, with love and respect, too often the kind of secular social justice activists get queasy around the faith community when they forget that that is the single biggest engine for change in America. Right. So I'll answer the question more fully in a minute, but okay. I've already talked way too much, so I'll stop with that.
So Keesha, why don't you talk about this as a moral issue? How do you come to this? I know it's at the heart of a lot of your work at Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
It is. So I'm honored to be on the panel, and I think I struggled a bit because everyone on the panel, well, Jeff, you can. You
have company.
I'm the asterisk.
Is a theologian, and I am a constitutional scholar. When I teach constitutional law, and the one thing that is quite clear amongst lawyers is morality is not at the top of the list when people think about us. And I think the one thing that was really important about this issue as a person of faith and a member of the LGBT community and organizer by birth and an attorney by training and a funder by accident, you know, all these labels very much come together in the work, and we care very much at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund about the relationship between money and our representative democracy and our Republican, small r, form of government that we're supposed to be having, and what are the promises of Article 4, Section 4 of our Constitution. We say we have a Republican form of government in this country and what that means. And I read Losing Faith in Our Democracy, and I realized there was a whole aspect of this conversation that we don't often bring in. And I took that report and I sent it to all the lawyers I know who are thinking creatively about this issue. I'm like, you have to bring this in. And ultimately, the thing I took out of that reading that struck me more than anything was morality was about outcomes. That the report was very clear. When we talk about morality, it's not simply about process. But we have to recall our Constitution, our constitutional guarantees are about process, not outcomes. We are entitled to a fair trial. We are not entitled to be found innocent if we are. If we have a fair trial, even if we're found guilty, our constitutional obligations have been met. But our moral obligations have not. And our government and our representative democracy looks to our political process to define these outcomes. And the political process is very much about the communities in which we live, the voices in which we speak. And if those voices cannot be meaningfully heard, there is no room for morality in our democracy, and it must come from these voices. And again, as a person of faith, as an African American, as a member of the LGBT community, I am fully aware that our legal processes are often insufficient to arrive at the question of morality for all of us as Americans. And so as we think about the role of faith communities, and we talk about our democracy, is incredibly important to the work that we do here. So I don't know if I answered it accurately, but I think it is very much the part of the dynamic as we think about what is the relationship between the formal structures and systems that are promised by our Constitution, and what is the moral standard to which we are called as Americans, as citizens, as persons of faith.
I'm going to go down to you, Jeff. Thank you, Keesha. You were actually preaching to me. I don't know, maybe you're a hidden faith leader, who knows. But about this issue as a moral issue for you as a person of faith. So I'm going to invite you to come out in this context as a person of faith.
My confession.
Yeah. Tell us why you care about this as a moral issue.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks again to all of you for being here, and particularly for inviting me to join this conversation. And it's a long story, and I don't have a condensed version of it very well, but I would say, like Keesha, I came to this first and most directly as a constitutional lawyer, as a practitioner of the law, I filed a brief in the Citizens United case. I've been long used to looking at policy and other issues through the lens of the law, but I have found in these past 6 years that what really is at the root of all this is the morality part that Keesha's talking about. And to me, I have found a happy coincidence, not coincidence, but coincidence of my faith and my obligations, I think, as an American, as a constitutional lawyer, and as I understand the Constitution. And I don't mean to suggest that in the sense that we sometimes hear of, oh, America is a Christian nation. I don't mean that. But to me, I see maybe it's something like the hope and history rhyming, but that's not quite the right metaphor, but the rhyming of the American promise of equality, of that promise from the Declaration of Independence that is, winds its way through the DNA, as I view it, of our Constitution. And when I say our Constitution, I mean all of our Constitution, including the 27 amendments, and what I trust will be the 28th Amendment. The constitutional pathway of our country tracks for me the pathway of a fundamental understanding that all human beings are equal. And that's a fundamental faith understanding for me. And particularly as I understand more deeply how damaging the ideology of Citizens United, the ideology of an attempt to impose in this country classes of citizens, essentially valuing citizens by their wealth, that you have more say, you have more access, you have more rights, essentially, if you have more money, is both unconstitutional, a violation of the American promise of equality, and a basic sin. Everything that I understand Jesus to have preached and promised us is about breaking down distinctions of human beings based on wealth, about breaking down structures of power that favor the privileged and favor those who have material wealth, and literally the same metaphor we use in Money of Politics, leveling the playing field. And that's the coincidence in my work and in my life, I think, of faith and my basic obligations, like everybody, secular and otherwise, as Americans, to those propositions that we're all created equal.
Yeah, I wondered if I was going to use the word sin, but I'm glad that you did. Okay.
It's a sin in my view.
Let's just say it. Okay. Let's just say it. Preach it. Okay. So Patrick, you have you and your organization, the Franciscan Action Network, are deeply involved in this issue, and you're putting in your dues. So tell us how this is a moral issue for you, and also some of the work that you're doing in an interfaith way to try to build a coalition.
So, and let me first of all just say that I'm not a theologian. So I tell people my theological training was 2 high school religion classes, one by a very conservative priest and one by a very liberal priest. So I'm somewhat of a schizophrenic spiritual person. I think that if in a Christian tradition, we go all the way back to the founding of our faith, Jesus, and the story of him turning the tables over of the moneylenders in the temple. And, so he approached this issue right from the beginning. That was one of his core teachings, was about the corruption of money. In Matthew 6, it says, you cannot worship both God and money. So it's just deeply in our tradition, as it should be. Somewhere along the line, some of us lost our way. in the 4th century, there was a Christian theologian, Basil. He's called Basil the Great. I don't know if there's a Basil the Lesser or not, but there is a Basil the Great, St. Basil. And he said, and I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but he said that if you have more money than you need, and there are people who have less money, then you're a thief, and you're stealing money from those who are in need. It's not your money, you're stealing it. And he was calling it a sin. He was pretty blunt about it, and he's considered one of the great theologians in the Christian tradition. So it's ingrained in what we do and what we think. And it's also ingrained to be an activist. I'm more of an activist than a theologian. Jonah mentioned the civil rights movement, but you can go back to the Underground Railroad, which was a religious movement, a faith movement, and most of the sites for the Underground Railroads were churches where slaves, runaway slaves would hide. The labor movement, early labor movement, got its foundation from the Catholic social teachings. In my own tradition, in the Franciscan tradition, when they were building the farm workers movement in California, Cesar Chavez lived with Franciscans. They housed them, and all of the organizers lived in Franciscan communities so that they could help organize the farm workers. So it's something that's just ingrained in what we do. But the other part of it is, and I think it was Congressman Edwards who said this, about making people feel uncomfortable. It's in the Christian tradition and all traditions, we say that you're never going to transform in your comfort zone. If you're now stepping out of your comfort zone, you're not going to change. And so part of what we have to do is make people feel uncomfortable. We have to challenge them. This is what Jesus did. It's what St. Francis of Assisi did. They challenged people to get out of that comfort zone, to look at things differently. And we also have to be willing, and all of us are willing, should be willing, to risk. If you're not willing to risk something, then you're not really doing the work. For me, I do civil disobedience all the time. I tell people, when I have friends come down to D.C., most people give them tours of the monuments. I give people tours of all the places I've been arrested. So we have to be willing to put ourselves out there as people of faith to take that chance. The other part of it, though, is, this has been ongoing for a long time, but about 20, 30 years ago, we sort of lost our way, both parts, the secular progressive movement and the faith movement. There's a great book written by Rabbi Michael Lerner called The Left Hand of God, and he talks about how the progressive movement sort of lost its way and alienated the faith, didn't alienate, but just stopped working with the faith communities, felt that there was this separation of church and state, and so we can't work with faith communities. And faith leaders started thinking the same thing, especially progressive faith leaders, started thinking, well, there's a separation of church and state, so we can't get involved in these issues. And that's really nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. So it's great to see it coming together again, and the faith community coming together and being leaders. I do want to say one last thing about this, though, and I think Jonah would say this also. We have this expression in the faith community called rent a collar. So what was happening for a long time was people, the secular community would be organizing a rally or an event, and they'd say, oh, we need to get a rabbi or a priest or a minister to come and say a prayer at the beginning. So they'd call around to see who they could find, and then the rabbi or the priest or the minister would come and give a blessing at the beginning of a rally. We've gotten out of that business. If the faith community's not at the table at the beginning when we're planning and organizing, and I've taken this position with my organization, then we're not interested. We'll lend some support to it, but if we're not at the table planning it, and then particularly around the messaging of it. And I'll give you an example of that. Next April 29th is going to be a big mobilization here in D.C. on climate justice. It's the people who did People's Climate March are coming together, and they've asked us to be at the table at the beginning to plan and message it. So that's kind of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Great. So Keesha, you and Jonah both talked a little bit, and I'm picking up, and Patrick, you mentioned it too, this secular, progressive, faith-rooted justice divide. The saying goes that change happens at the speed of trust. So I'm just wondering how each of you might, in turn, talk about how you, I don't know why there's all this feedback, anyway, how we do that. How do we bring these forces together so that we have greater collective impact?
I think a lot of it relates to I think some of the comments that Patrick just made about everyone being at the table from the beginning. It is very, very difficult when we're working and organizing spaces to come up with an idea and then say, okay, you formulate everything and this, that, and the other, we're all ready to go. Okay, who's missing? We need faith. We need Latinos. We need, oh gosh. And all of a sudden we're trying to check these boxes to bring people to the table and to adopt a model or an idea that's been well vetted and well formulated, but doesn't actually integrate the ideas and values of the people we're actually seeking to change and integrate into the process. So I think that's a big piece of it. But there is, I think, something a little special about secular progressive movements and communities of faith. There is oftentimes a lack of trust because, as you identified, what did you say, like 80% of Americans identify in some faith tradition, which means there's a lot of different faith traditions, and there is a wide range of acceptance in different areas within the secular populations. And so that can be a struggle. People really do have to try and figure out how do we overcome some of these questions around what does it mean when you walk into a room and say, I'm a Christian or a person of faith, and like a third of the room is like, okay, right? You've got a third of the room saying, okay, I fundamentally disagree with everything you believe in, right? They don't know who you are, but they fundamentally identify. Then you've got another quarter of the room that's like, oh, that have that sort of anti-intellectual, if you believe in God, you can't really be a big thinker. Someone's just gonna, yeah. And so you've got like all these assumptions that carry forward and really interrupt the ability to have these conversations. And I think that is a big part of your work, Patrick, and some other work. And maybe Jeff can speak to how you've kind of dealt with some of these questions in your space. But that is something as a funder, we consistently kind of say, how do we get folks to the table and how do we build this trust, recognizing that there have been some legitimate arguments as to why communities can't always come together in an open and honest way and not feel safe within those conversations.
Do you want to say a couple of words? I know
I
our
know
time
you're
is
getting
short.
the
I'm
2 minute
watching.
warning.
Yeah,
So
I'm
very
watching.
briefly,
I'm watching.
we work institutionally. We work very closely with the NAACP and PICO, and I name those two as organizations that are deeply committed to their grassroots chapters and a relationship-based model of work. So that it's about getting people at the pew-to-pew level in their local communities talking to one another, knowing one another, trusting one another, and then they can get into the fight with one another. One last thing, because I hope people read the report. There's a really interesting tension around corporations and people. And there's one theological argument that corporations are not people, but that corporations, because we're churches or we're congregations, we're bodies politic. The Jewish community is pretty clear on this. In just a few hours, I'm going to be at synagogue, and we're going to be saying, Al chet shechatanu lefanecha. We have sinned collectively. So what the difference between a body politic like a congregation and a corporation is that a corporation's bottom line is money, whereas a congregation's bottom line is the people that embody that congregation. So I just want to be clear that in the faith community, I think when we take a stand and differentiate between people who are accountable and corporations, the bottom line of a corporation is profit, whereas the bottom line of a congregation or a community is our faith in our God and our humanity.
And let me just jump in real quick. Jonah mentioned collective sin. In the Christian faith, we've moved away from the idea of collective sin, and it's all about individual sin. And that's one of the failings that we have as Christians, is that we think it's about me. And in fact, Christianity, the way it's formed today, is a capitalistic. If I do good and I do really good, then I'll get to heaven. Whereas Jesus talked about the collective sin. Everything was about the collective. And one other point is, we also have to get away from this idea, I think, that I'm a faith leader or Jonah's a faith leader. Jeff is as much a faith leader as any of us are. But sometimes, we're afraid to say that. You're afraid to say that in your setting, that I'm a faith leader, but you are. And everyone in this room who is a person of faith is also a faith leader. And that's, I think, how we start to build that trust up, that we start to recognize the fact in each of us that we're all leaders and people of faith, and combine those two.
And Keesha, we won't leave you out unless you want to be left.
Oh, you too.
We see you as an important,
I am duly
person of
excluded,
faith.
and I'm okay with
You're
that.
duly included. You're duly included. So I guess the last thing I want to say, and obviously we could go on for a very long time. I'm sorry we can't, and hopefully we will in the future. This is a season where a lot of people are opting out of voting, or at least talking about it. playing with that idea. And I think the test for all of us right now is to get people to vote, to get people engaged in the political process, whether they think they're being heard or not. And this, all of you here today, is evidence that you care about that. So let's start and begin by helping people to realize that they simply must vote in this election season.
Amen.
So thank you, panel. Thank you, audience.